Hello everyone. Welcome to Introduction to Research. If you're listening to this video, it's probably because you have not taken a research class before or you want to review some foundational topics. I hope that I will entice you to be interested in a wide range of research topics. First of all, I'm going to give you a few definitions. Then we're going to talk about processes of research and contexts of research. And perhaps we'll get to typologies, although that is less important to this introductory deck of slides. What is research? Spending hours reading blogs on the internet. That is research in terms of everyday language, but it's not research in terms of research language. Research usually involves doing something intentionally. It means I want to find out about a particular thing, and I usually am doing that for more than just my own benefit. I usually want to share the findings with someone. That's why I need to articulate what I'm doing and why I hope to do it. One definition of research is systematically looking for an answer to a question. Assuming that we're talking social science research, which is my assumption in making this video, we are interested in how our participants perceive something. Our research is also influenced by how we as researchers perceive that something. And very often, research is influenced by other stakeholders, audiences, or funders, who also have their perceptions of the world. Because I happen to teach more often than not in educational settings, I want to define educational research. This is Carl Hostetler's definition of good educational research, which is that such good research articulates a connection to a robust and justifiable conception of human well-being. A lot of times we think our research is just our research. ABC, we're going to jump through the hoops, we're going to get it done, and great, we've accomplished our mission. Forgetting about the fact that we are human beings, and the people we're studying are human beings, and that either implicitly or explicitly, we usually intend to do something to help human beings. So we need to be explicit in the process of our research about who we're trying to help and in what ways. There happen to have been a lot of criticisms of educational research over the years, particularly in the United States, but more broadly. This Hartas book that I'm citing here is published in the UK, and some of their criticisms of educational research also hold in the US. So first of all, funding can put particular expectations in place that may or may not be best for the context of who we are trying to help. The abilities and attitudes of researchers may get in the way. I would like to hope that it's more often ability than attitude. At the very least, it's true that many educational researchers over many decades have not had in-depth training in processes of research to the extent that physical scientists have had. There are also possible hindrances, although possible merits, in the publishing process. Peer review, if I have a peer reviewer who is sympathetic with what I'm trying to accomplish, then the peer review can be a beneficial experience. If the peer reviewer is not sympathetic with the cause, then that process may be a hindrance. Methodology, oftentimes in educational research and somewhat more broadly in social science research, may lack rigor. Now, rigor is really a difficult word to latch on to because it means different things to different people. But I pose for our introductory context that we can think of rigor as being transparent about what we're doing. Intentional and transparent. Another problem related to methodology is oftentimes the literature we select to inform our studies may be more superficial than necessary. We may not find the full depth of literature that's available. And then another problem is it's related to that literature issue, if we don't contextualize our outcomes relative to existing literature, or if we don't contextualize our outcomes relative to the contexts in which the studies take place, then we are not doing our beneficiaries a favor. So I like to use the word inquiry, and I like to use it as synonymous with research. It is not always used that way. Many of these terms I'm talking about today are used different ways in different contexts. So when we read, we have an obligation to learn what the terms are intended to mean by the person who's used them. At any rate, a definition of inquiry is questioning and searching with intent. Mindfully inquiring, looking at deep conscious or unconscious assumptions. And I would say realizing that even when we ask our participants for conscious opinions or actually even ask them for knowledge, what we are often getting is unconscious assumptions. Evaluating is another term that comes up in education and in social sciences more broadly. To evaluate something is to determine the benefit of a program or policy. And that benefit, I pose, does not necessarily need to be monetary. A lot of times evaluation does look at the benefit for a specific amount of money, and I think there are ways that we can look at some applied topics, such as whether we allow kids to stand or sit or walk around the room. That kind of thing, we could build an intervention such as that without much of any cost, and then look at the outcomes, and we would still be evaluating that intervention without talking about money. Measuring. Basically, measuring has to do with converting something to numbers. So in social sciences, we're usually talking about human behaviors, converting human behaviors to numbers. Sometimes we try to convert attitudes and perceptions to numbers. And the problem with that is not inherently in doing so, but when we don't realize that the process of categorizing attitudes is not as the numbers are not as finite or solid as they are when we're counting pencils, let's say. Educational assessment. A lot of times the word assessment and the word measuring go together, but assessment can be done without numbers, with or without numbers. Assessment is gathering information about a particular goal, and in education it's usually an achievement goal, and it usually ends up with numbers, but it is possible to assess something about a quality that might not necessarily have numbers to it. So the quality in which, let's say we're interested in the supportive attitude of teachers and how their supportive attitude affects students. Conceptually, we could try to do that without numbers, but I don't want to get too distracted by presence or absence of numbers yet. I do want to point out that the data we gather in itself may not have meaning. We may need to interpret the data in order to have meaning. As researchers, we may be able to interpret the data easily enough, but if I have a set of data and somehow, let's say my data is in a stack of papers that get wind blown across the street. If somebody were to pick up those papers, would they be able to interpret meaning from the data without having known the context that I know as a researcher? And my intended answer is they probably would not be able to infer the same contextual meaning as I would, having known the context. Therefore, there's a difference between data. Data are the things that immediately come out of our study. Information are the interpretations of the data that come out of the study, and the interpretations or the information must be informed by the context. Methods and methodologies. So methods are the tools that we use. We have an instrument that we gather data with. We have, let's say, a spreadsheet of the potential sample members, of the people we actually contacted to complete the study. We may have conducted interviews. We may have sent a web instrument. All of those things are tools. But if we contextualize the tools and we intentionally acknowledge that we have purpose statements, we have contexts that directly or indirectly affect the results that come out of those interviews and those instruments and those tools, it is then the contextualized methods that we refer to as methodologies, and it is the methodologies that allow us to make meaning. out of what we have gathered as data from methods. So, processes and contexts. One process to which you probably all can relate is any kind of sporting event. I just happen to have chosen a soccer ball here. So, a lot of sporting events have coaches. Well, the Saturday morning soccer coach, he has a plan for his team. And he talks with them about the plan, and they go out on the field. And lo and behold, if this coach is coaching your child's soccer team, do you want him to rigidly impose the plan on the game no matter how the other team plays? Or do you want the coach to respond and help the kids or the players on the team respond to the other team? I dare say that you would want the coach to be responsive. And that is my motto as a researcher. Being responsive, we might say, is being emergent, allowing the study to evolve, responding to the study as it evolves, rather than only being predetermined. Yes, we have to plan. That makes our study strong. But if we plan and then we don't respond to what happens in the middle of the game or in the middle of the study, then we are being overly predetermined and our study won't flow so well. Another term that comes up a lot in mixed methods but may be helpful to be aware of is data has a cycle. Data has a flow. Studies have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and then we can go from the end to beginning another study. The end of one study informs the next study. But a particular study or a particular strand of data starts by conceptualizing, designing, implementing, and then drawing inferences. That whole research life cycle pertains to a particular strand of data. We might think of it as a set of data, although it's possible that you could end up with multiple sets of data from one strand. The research life cycle. Related to the strand, it starts with a design, and then the implementation that I mentioned can be thought of as data collection, data management, and then data analysis and interpretation go together, and then that informs the next set of purpose statements and research questions. Scientific method also has a cycle. Scientific method originated from physical sciences. It involves making an observation, asking research questions, stating hypotheses about what we think the outcome will be, gathering the data, and then developing a theory from that. Notice in the center, there's this iterative process between stating the hypothesis, gathering the data, accepting or rejecting the hypothesis, modifying the hypothesis, until we feel like our theory is ready enough to move on. The question is, in what ways is scientific method appropriate for psychosocial settings? And that question relates to the question of whether each of us as researchers views ourselves as more objectively oriented or subjectively oriented. Really, it's a question of how do we view the human world. Do we view the human world as a world that we can objectively know? Or do we view the human world as a world that is embedded in human psyche much of which is not objectively knowable. And then these two ends of a spectrum may not just be two categorical buckets. A lot of researchers may weave back and forth between seeing the world in objective ways and seeing it in subjective ways. But this will be, I pose, the biggest challenge for you, a person listening to this video, with some of the earliest conceptions you have about research. You will do yourself a favor if you think about whether you believe you can know human nature objectively or subjectively or both. The question I ask is, whose beliefs are we studying? Are we studying, if I'm the researcher, are we studying my beliefs? Are we studying the participants' beliefs? And if we are studying the participants' beliefs, are there ways that I can lay aside my beliefs in order to make that happen? Or to some extent, do I just acknowledge that, hey, my beliefs are part of this? The question comes up, who defines knowledge? And that's a very culturally based question, because inherently when we think of knowledge, we are probably not aware, but we are inferring knowledge based on the context with which we are familiar, which are usually our own cultural experiences. And then there's a question of what theories, and theories are not something you need to worry about right now, but you'll have plenty of opportunity to read about and build work in relationship to existing theories if you want to. So just some words that you do not need to memorize at this point, just want you to be exposed to. Epistemology is belief about how we know what we want to know as researchers. Paradigm is the assumptions or the beliefs that guide our research, and in fact, paradigms can switch from one study to the next. Even though as a researcher, my epistemology may remain relatively constant, but my paradigmatic lens may be somewhat evolutionary. Theory, I'll just mention a couple theories you may have heard of. Critical race theory, social development of Vygotsky, ecological systems of Bronfenbrenner. Methodology, I've already mentioned, is a set of tools contextualized by the epistemology, the paradigm, and the theoretical lens. And then the methods are the specific tools. I'm not going to read this slide right now. I'll let you come back to it. It gives an example of my dissertation, what my researcher experience was, my personal human experience, how that related to my topic, what my philosophical orientation was and still is, for that matter, and then the theory that I chose to use for that particular study, which for another study could be a different theory. One way of looking at research methodologies is that they are situated by the micro, meso, and macro contexts. Those are the sociological contexts in which they operate. But the personal context would be my personal experiences, the personal experiences of my participants. And the interpersonal context could be the interactions between myself and my participants, or between myself and other research team members, or in the case of a dissertation, between myself and my advisor. The societal context would be the larger context. So the university at which I am teaching is in a larger U.S. context, and there are not a lot of expectations at the university where I'm at to follow national federal regulations, but there are at least cultural expectations. And those cultural expectations are going to influence what those of us in my department, my program, the college, which I'm located, all of those groups of people are influenced by the larger, in this case, a Great Plains state, a Midwest state, national. It doesn't have to be a geographic boundary, but culture really does pervade what we view as strong methodologies. The rest of this deck of slides talks about the distinction between qualitative and quantitative research. It is a distinction that I pose is not as necessary as we make it. We have come as researchers to talk a lot about qualitative and quantitative research, partly in order to talk about mixed methods. It's been ironic that mixed methods, in my opinion, has in some ways pushed the qualitative quantitative poles apart. But I like to think of the distinction between the two this way. I like to think of qualitative research as less structured. It doesn't mean it's not rigorous or not systematic, but it allows participants to interact in more fluid ways. And quantitative research is more structured. It does not allow participants to formulate their own responses. They can formulate their own thoughts, but they have to translate their thoughts onto the researcher's expectations. Some quick slides of what a structured questionnaire might look like with checkboxes. A structured data set where we get a column with this ID number, a column with age, so on. Every row is a participant. Or moving from structured to less structured, more open-ended, here is an instrument, and there's a lot of white space on the instrument so that when I'm interviewing someone open-endedly, I can write notes. I'm probably audio recording, but there's no check boxes. The answer responses don't have to be as finite. Here is a transcript that comes from an open-ended interview. And then just some quick heuristics, some quick shortcuts of how we might think of things. We can have a qualitative strand that qualitatively collects, analyzes, and interprets data. We can have a quantitative strand that quantitatively collects, analyzes, interprets data. Mixed methods would involve two complete strands where you would have quantitative collection and analysis. You'd have qualitative collection and analysis. And then at some point, you'd merge those together. You can either merge them together at the end, or you can merge them together in between, doing, for example, qualitative collection and analysis, then using those findings to develop an instrument, then quantitative collection and analysis, and then interpretation. So mixed methods has at least two sets of strands. And some of you may move on to another set of slides where I talk about the spectrum or the continuum of qualitative to quantitative research. But this has been lengthy enough, so I leave you here for now and hope that we will connect again in the future. Thank you for listening. Feel free to contact me if you have questions. Bye-bye.